fourth graders. This is Mrs. Kalan here. Happy to connect with all of you again. I hope that you had some time to relax during our spring break. Even though I know all of you were at home, I hope that it gave you an opportunity to relax a little bit with your families and do some things that you really enjoy. And now we're back to school. Even though we're not all together, I'm excited about so many of the things that we're going to do over the next few weeks, and just enjoy checking in with you. So I hope you're all reading some great books while you're at home. I know I am. I've been reading some of the recent Newbery winners from this year. I just finished reading a book called Other Words for Home, which was one of the Newbery winners for this year. I've also been reading a lot of books with my kids, including books with my 1-year-old who likes to read the same book 3 times or 4 times in a row. So some of my books at home I'm beginning to know really well. We read In the Night Kitchen 3 times just before his nap a couple hours ago. So, you know, we're getting lots of opportunity to read together as a family. I hope you are too. So what we're going to do today is I just wanted to check in with you first about the Cook Prize, the last lessons that we were doing together. And I know that your teachers did send these out to you right before or during spring break. I did not expect everybody to get to these right away, but I would like to make sure that everybody watches these and votes by the end of this week, so that next week when we meet together, we can have an opportunity to look at the results together, announce the winners, and I'm going to put together some really cool charts and graphs so you can see, we can see not just who the winner was overall, but we can break it down by class, by grade, because the 3rd graders and 5th graders are, some of them are participating in this as well. So it's really cool to have as much participation as possible so that we can look at the results in a like complex and specific way. So like if everybody participates, then we can really see how the class felt, the 2 classes felt as a whole, and what the majority opinion really was. So if you have not gotten a chance to watch all of the Cook Prize videos yet and cast your vote, please do that this week. What I'm going to do today is a somewhat shorter lesson. All we're going to do after this is just read one more chapter of the 21 Balloons. I brought this home with me from the library before we left school so that I could continue reading it with you. We're going to be doing some things that are different over the next few weeks, but we'll here and there continue to check in with Professor Sherman's journey. And so we'll kind of make it a quick one this time. We'll just read one chapter, and then I do want to make sure that everybody gets to the Cook Prize voting. I'm going to have, even before this lesson goes out, I'm going to have your teachers send out a reminder to make sure that you get to that as soon as possible. Okay? If anybody has any questions about that, please email me if any of the videos aren't working for you, or you need something different, then I'm always happy to help. Okay, so for now, let's get back to Professor Sherman's journey. I believe the 2 classes, Miss Eulow's class and Miss Levin's class, were in about the same place, but just to remind you where we were, in the 21 Balloons, Professor Sherman is on the island of Krakatoa. He's stranded there, and he has found out now a lot of interesting information about the place that he has found himself and the people who are living there. This is a volcanic island that is constantly rocked by parts of the volcanic eruption. The ground shakes, and there are diamond mines, the most wealthy, most extravagant diamond mines anywhere in the world are hidden underneath this island, and the residents of this island have decided to keep it secret. They're creating their own society. Each household now lives by a different name, a letter of the alphabet. Each household has a restaurant that is cooks food according to a culture whose name begins with their letter of the alphabet. And we are now arriving at chapter. Anyone know Roman numerals here? This is actually, we are now on chapter 7. This is called The Moroccan House of Marbles. On our way to Mr. M's house, I asked Mr. F what the citizens of Krakatoa did with all of their spare time. You've told me that only the families with creative interests were chosen by Mr. M to come here. You said that people with inventive minds were selected because they would be less apt to be bored on a small island such as this. Well, I asked, how is that working out? You have 19 days out of each of your months in which, according to your constitution, you have no work to do. Are you bored, or have your interests kept you busy? We are kept busy here in much the same manner as people are kept busy in any other country, except, of course, that the diamond mines which we own place our living at a slightly higher standard. Keeping busy in other countries is usually interpreted as earning a living. Earning a living means, in its simplest form, providing food and shelter. Our restaurant government takes care of our food needs. We have devoted our combined creative abilities to making our shelters as magnificent as possible. We have built the houses which you now see one at a time. We chose for a house each represented country, which we thought was most typically beautiful in that country. And then we went ahead and built it. For instance, my house is very much like the famous Petit Trianon. I bought the detailed plans of the Petit Trianon in a little shop in Versailles. Do you remember which country Mr. F takes his inspiration from? F for France. We had bought the stones all cut to order in France and then loaded them onto our ship and brought them back to Krakatoa. These stones were all numbered in lettered corresponding with the plans. Building my house was as enjoyable to us as a huge set of toy blocks is to a young child. On subsequent trips, we brought suitable furniture. We all worked together until each house was completed. The builders supervised the actual construction. The painters selected either the paintings or made copies of originals, or made paintings of their own for their houses. We handled, furnished, and decorated each house as a hobby, a fabulous hobby, of the richest families in the world, which is what we happen to be. It has kept us working pretty hard. Is the food here always good, I asked? Or do some families, out of laziness or lack of interest, prepare poor meals on their days? No one seems to have slipped up yet. As soon as you start to run a restaurant, you become tremendously interested in food. I suppose that it is simply pride which makes one try to make their better meals than other families. As you see, on your day, every family comes to your house to eat. I always find that on F Day, I am somehow trying to prove that my day is the best. Then there's this to consider. We are all interested in food and look forward to eating. If I were to prepare a poor F Day at my house, I would have reason to fear that others would do the same on their days, and we would have a miserable month of food. I understand, I said. But everything doesn't work out as neatly as I have made it seem, particularly now that all of our houses are finished. To be sure, we work very hard on our day of the month, but recently I've spent a considerable amount of time doing nothing at all. What's wrong with that? I hastily added. Nothing, shouted Mr. F. I am happy to see that you are a good loafer. Certain prudish people in other countries seem to find that busy hands keep out of mischief, or some silly idea. We have developed loafing on this island in such an expert extent that even our hands are completely relaxed. You know what loafing means? Loafing is, what many of us would like to be doing right now, just relaxing, doing nothing. Maybe you've gotten the opportunity to do some loafing during your time at home, just watching TV and, hanging out, not doing anything in particular, not keeping busy. Our only work now, besides cooking, is in trying to make life more pleasant for ourselves and for each other. The house you are about to see is one in which we've been all working lately. It was the first to be completed, and now we are going all over it with new improvements. If some of our inventions work in this house, we will install them in other houses. From the outside, Mr. F continued, you can plainly see that Mr. M's Moroccan house is of simple and solid construction. It is one of the main reasons we chose to work on it first. It is easier to adapt new ideas to this house of simple, rigid lines than it would be, for example, a house with domes and minarets and towers such as Mr. T's Turkish coffee house. We have discovered right away that almost all of us have had ideas of improvements that required some form of mechanical motive power. So we all made over to the cellar of Mr. M's house. The usual cellars of our houses are filled with barrels of wine. We dug a separate cellar next door and lined it with the usual diamond boulders to make it sound and immovable, and built a roof over it, and moved Mr. M's fine Moroccan wines into this new private cache. Most of our ideas required hydraulic pumps to put them into motion. So we first installed a steam engine in Mr. M's cellar. But here we are. Come, I'll take you first into the cellar. So this sort of begins one of my favorite parts of this book, which is the introduction of the many inventions of Krakatoa. We were greeted at the door by Mr. and Mrs. M and their children, M1 and M2. Remember that families now don't have individual names. They've had to rename themselves Mr. and Mrs. letter and, M1, M2, A1, A2. So imagine if you and your siblings were, A1, A2, B1, B2. In my family, I guess, would be Mrs. K, and my sons would be K1 and K2 instead of Sammy and Gabriel. We followed Mr. M down into the cellar. There was a boiler and a furnace which looked much like the equipment to be found in the cellar of any American home, and Mr. M told us that stoking the fire for a steam engine was no more difficult than keeping an ordinary furnace running. The room was well insulated because on a tropical island it would be impossible to live in a house heated by the sun above and a furnace below. Of course, the boiler was piped to the pistons of a huge steam engine. This was different from anything found in the ordinary American home. The rest of the cellar was an extraordinary maze of polished brass shafts running along the floor to the ceiling. The flywheel of the steam engine was furnished to operate numerous hydraulic pumps, which evidently made the brass shafts go up and down. The steam engine was also attached to an electric generator. This whole cellar was a sort of mechanical jungle of more complicated than the engine room of a ship. And here we see the steam engine pumping away in the cellar of Mr. M's house. I was anxious to get out of there fast, first of all, because I was dying to see what all this machinery operated upstairs. And then there too seemed to be so little space in this huge room in which to move around without being burned, smeared with grease, crushed, or receiving electric shocks. Mr. F seemed to feel the same way about the room, and only Mr. M and M1 and M2 felt at home as they dashed through the brass forest, checking dials and gauges. I noticed, as we were about to leave, the two long white sheets of cloth were coming from a slit in the ceiling down into the cellar. These wide cloth bands passed through a sort of large flat boiler and then on through what appeared to be kind of drying machines used in paper factories, and then back through the rollers up through another slit in the ceiling. What in the world is that? I asked. Come, said Mr. F. First I will show you Mr. and Mrs. M's bedroom. We walked upstairs into a bedroom on the first floor. It was furnished in excellent Moroccan taste. I say excellent with some reservations. I personally am not too fond of that style. But aside from these observations, I have noticed nothing unusual about the first room. Have there been improvements made in this room? I asked. Mrs. M used to be a nurse, replied Mr. F. And to nurses, bed making seems to be an extremely boring after a while. If you stop to think about it, nurses in large hospitals spend a good deal of time making beds. This is probably not so true anymore. Nurses have more medical responsibilities, and there are other jobs that in a hospital that would probably do most of the bed making, but they might help. It is natural that they should soon tire of it, particularly when they find themselves to be as rich as Mrs. M. We all came to Mrs. M's rescue with this amazing bed. It has continuous sheets. How does that work? I immediately inquired. Mr. F walked over to Mrs. M's bureau, her dresser table, and opened the top drawer, and from there was a crank. He inserted the crank into a hole at the footboard of the bed and asked me to watch closely. He started to twist the crank, and the sheet started to move across the bed, passing on rollers through a sideboard on the floor. When I twist this crank, explained Mr. F, the sheets pass through this sideboard, through the floor, down to the cellar. I'm going to show you, here's the bed, and here is Mr. M demonstrating as he is turning the crank. Do you think your family would like to have that so that they don't have to change their sheets? Just turn the crank and it washes and changes the sheets for you. There they pass through a boiler where they are washed and pushed through a drying machine. Next, they pass through steam-heated rollers where they are pressed and come out through the floor on the other side of the bed on rollers and then back up to the top of the bed. This continuous sheet is marked off in bed widths. Every morning, Mrs. M simply turns the crank until a bed width has passed from one side to the other of her bed. This action starts the drying machine. This action starts the washing machines, diverts the heat from the furnace to the drying machines. While one length of sheets is being pressed, fresh widths of hot white sheets are revealed onto the bed. Incredible, I exclaimed, but what about the blankets? Good Lord, man, said Mr. F, we never use blankets here. We're just a few miles below the equator. Oh, that's right, I said. Have you made inventions for every room of the house? We have. Each family originally chose a room to work on, and although several families have worked on some rooms, we are all interested in the dining room. I'll show you that one next. You see, there are many problems attached to feeding 80 people, even if it's only once a month. There are 4 family members of each family, and the children help a lot, but even though you can still well imagine that there are problems of preparing an elaborate breakfast, clearing that off and preparing lunch, getting that out of the way and getting dinner ready can be big and tiresome. What do you think of this dining room? He asked. I looked at the room that he had just entered. It was enormous, but absolutely bare. The floor was highly polished and had sort of a design of discs on it, one large disc surrounded by 4 smaller ones. This design was repeated 20 times on the floor. The walls had pictures hanging on them, scenes of charging men on horsebacks, portraits of marabouts, sultans, and viziers. It looks like a Moroccan ballroom of sorts, I answered. Where are the chairs and tables? Exactly, said Mr. F. It's easy to clean, Professor Sherman? No tables to sweep under, no chairs to get in your way. Perfect, I answered, but what do you eat on? At this, a wild look came over Mr. F's face. Watch this, he said. He watched out in the hall and pulled a great lever. He came back to my side and took me over to the far corner of the room. Look at the floor, he said, and I looked. Suddenly, small wisps and puffs of steam continued from these circular discs on the floor, and then these discs started to rise slowly, like some nightmarish garden of mushrooms. Soon each group of discs was coming out of the floor in little groups of 4 flat stools around little round tables. Clearing up is easy here, he said. After M1 and M2 have removed the dishes, silverware, and tablecloths, Mr. M lowers the chairs and tables by pressing a lever, and Mrs. M has then to wash the floors. The chairs and the tables and floors are all taken care of for the month in one motion. And here they are, our chairs and tables coming out of the floor. Bravo! But what goes on in other rooms of this Moroccan house of marvels? The living room isn't perfect by any means, but I'll show it to you if you want to see it. Lead on. You see, exclaimed Mr. F, lowering his voice considerably, Mr. P, Mr. Q, Mr. R were poor but extremely inventive scientists when they were picked by Mr. M to come to Krakatoa. They are all three of them fascinated by the extraordinary power and the many uses of electric current. It was they who insisted that the electric generator be attached to all this heavily burdened steam engine, to the already heavily burdened steam engine in the cellar. I think of all their newfound wealth going a little to their heads. Mr. M wasn't awfully anxious to turn over their living room to them. He feels that their ideas are perhaps a little too advanced, even for Krakatoa, but what could he do? He had already given the room to each of the families to work on, so he felt obliged to turn over the living room to these three remaining inventors. What in the world did they do to it? Electrified all the chairs and the couch, said Mr. F., in the hushed whisper of a man who was describing the work of a maniac. What for? I exclaimed hastily when I was about to enter the living room. They say that it's to move around the room more easily. I'll show you how they work. I wasn't too anxious to walk into this electric living room, but it felt safe to follow Mr. F. wherever he went. The floor was made of steel. The chairs had a decidedly unusual look about them. First of all, on the left of the chairs, and they were all armchairs, there was a little tiller much like the tiller of a sailboat. The chairs were on little wheels. There was a rod on the back of the chairs with a sort of steel brush on one end which touched the ceiling. The ceiling was covered with wire mesh. The scientists who improved this room say that a man who spends too much effort moving his chair around the room or walking from his chair to a window, the bookcase, or a table, or so forth, they figured that some men walk unnecessarily a half a mile a day just around the living room. I feel like people now maybe feel the opposite, that you need to try to get up and move around a little bit more than people actually do. These chairs were supposed to save people this trouble. Look, he said. He sat down in an armchair and drew the tiller around the front of them. I shall now move effortlessly around this card table and stop in front of the window. There is a little button at the end of this tiller, and I will push to start me off. I will steer the chair around with the tiller and stop by taking my thumb off the button. You ready? Go ahead, I said, backing into a corner. Mr. F. pushed the button at the top of the tiller. The chair shot around the table at breakneck speed, stopping in front of the window with such suddenness that Mr. F. was plunged head first out of the chair and through the open window. A shower of blue sparks followed the trail of the chair as the brush rubbed mesh on the ceiling. There, said Mr. F., climbing back through the window, out of breath and with a most distressed look on his face. You see that this was hardly what might be called an improvement in the living rooms. And we're actually going to stop there, but I will end with this picture of Mr. F. flying out the window in the electric living room chair. There we go. So I'm going to leave you with that today. We'll pick up on this here and there, but just kind of a thought to leave you with. What improvements would you make to your own house, especially now that you're probably spending a lot of time in it? What would you add to your house? What kind of wacky invention that might make your life either easier or maybe just more fun? If you feel like telling me about it, you can either just send me an email, draw me a picture. You could record yourself talking about it. Again, this is not an assignment, something that you have to do, but if it's something that you feel inspired to do, I would love to see what kind of inventions you would add to your house. I'm going to sign off now and just remind you to spend a little bit of time with the Cook Prize books and vote. I'm going to send a couple of reminders to vote because we really need for next week to have everybody's votes counted. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.